You're listening to WCAT Radio, your home for authentic Catholic programming.
Welcome to The Open Door, a show based on the words in Revelation, "I have left an open door before you, which no one can close." This is WCAT Radio's longest-running show, which opened the door to the radio station in October 2016. It's currently offered by Jim Hanink, Mario Ramos-Reyes and friends, and remains open to the love of God in its call to build a culture of life and a just social order through the panel's discussion of the Catholic social teaching principles of solidarity, subsidiarity, and economic democracy. The Open Door also explores nonviolence, distributism, and communitarianism. So join us at the Open Door, where you too can be part of the conversation.
Welcome to the Open Door. Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes. Today, we're going to talk about racial reparations. Our special and returning guest is Daniel Philpott, professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame. He specializes in religion and global politics with a focus on reconciliation, the political behavior of religious actors, and Christian political theology. His books include Revolutions in Sovereignty from Princeton, Just and Unjust Peace, an Ethic of Political Reconciliation from Oxford, and Religious Freedom in Islam, the Fate of a Universal Human Right in the Muslim World, again from Oxford. Most recently, he has authored an essay titled A Christian Case for Racial Reparations. Let's begin in prayer. Come, O Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful, and enkindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you shall renew the face of the earth. O God, who has taught the hearts of the faithful by the light of the Holy Spirit, grant that by the gift of the same Spirit we may be always truly wise and ever rejoice in his consolation. Through Christ our Lord. Amen.
Amen.
Let me begin with a metaphor. Is racism in America both like and unlike original sin?
Well, thank you. It's wonderful to be here and have a chance to discuss these ideas. You know, we talk about justice in context, and we've seen in the last 3 years or so, we just had the anniversary of the killing of George Floyd, a tremendous outbreak of protests, conversation, urgent demands about racism in America's past. And whatever one thinks about exactly the reality of racism or what kind of measures should be taken against it, it seems to be still with us. I mean, this is not a kind of resolved issue. The fact that it is so hotly disputed and talked about. And if you look at the differences in polling data, certainly African Americans overwhelmingly seem to think that there's still a problem. There's a vast disparities between whites and blacks over this. But the fact that there's a problem that persists, that goes deep in America's history, is where the analogy of original sin comes to be. Obviously, in the Bible, in the Christian tradition, original sin is something that happens with the first humans, and that every subsequent human, participates in, faces, the reality of original sin. So there is something metaphorical about it. But I think what it captures is the fact that this is something that is deep in American history. It goes back to colonial times, the early 17th century, to the legacy of slavery, the legacy of Jim Crow, the legacy of what I call economic distributive injustice. And it's still with us. It's still something that persists. And it's something that continues to be very debilitating and divisive and eats away and continues to have wounds, as sin does. Sin always is it's a wrong, but it's a wrong that diminishes flourishing, that leaves wounds. And so I think in all those ways, just talking about it as a kind of individual isolated sin that doesn't do justice to it. Original sin captures something of that deep-seated historical, collectively shared, ongoing wounds kind of phenomenon.
Reaches deep.
Yes.
Mario?
Well, it's very interesting. But the question, I think it is, if we inherited the original sin, we are talking about here a nation. How is it a nation rather than an individual or person need to apologize for a past wrong?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And this has to do with in what ways the injustice continues to endure or to stand in our life today. Now, a couple of ways that people deal with this. One is they, debate about whether there is racism today. And there are strong studies that show that there is, but then others to say, well, there's really not. We've gotten past that. Others say, well, the fact that you and I are not racist or haven't committed invidious discrimination, means that we're not responsible for the things that have happened. But I think there is a responsibility. And what I would point to is the collective nature of the injustices. Now, many kinds of injustices have what could be called a collective and an individual face to them. If one is wounded or victimized by a state or a corporation or some kind of collective entity, there's really these two different faces. On one hand, there's say one is a victim of a war crime. There is the act that the person who committed the crime chose to commit as an individual. And that individual dimension dies with the person who did it. But there's also a collective dimension. If I was wounded by a person in wearing a uniform, then in effect it was the state against whom I was wounded and was injured. Somebody acting in the name of the state, in the name of the laws, either empowered by unjust laws or acting contrary to the just laws, but nevertheless was done to me as a collective. This intuition, by the way, is what is behind scores of different apologies that have taken place in the last couple of generations. The apologies performed by German heads of state with regard to the Nazis, which have become more common since, say, around 1970. Apologies, Japan, Australia, Canada, many other examples. There were also the apologies of the Catholic Church voiced by Pope John Paul II. And he voiced over 100 apologies with respect to 21 different historical episodes. All of those only made sense because the wrongs had a collective dimension. They were committed in the name of a collectivity. And as long as that collectivity lives on, the collective dimension of that wrong lives on. So in the United States, you had slavery that was legalized by the state. You had Jim Crow laws that were passed by the state. You also had deeply unjust actions such as lynching and so forth that were not enforced by the state. And then you have what is called economic distribution, where the state was responsible for vastly discriminatory disbursement of vast amounts of funds that did a lot to create inequality. So these were wrongs that were perpetrated by the state in the name of the collective. And it is those wrongs that for which there can be reparations or apologies reciprocally voiced in the name of the head of state, or the one who speaks authoritatively for the state.
That's very helpful. Dan, let's focus now on just what counts as reparations. What's your working definition of reparations?
Here I look to the United Nations, which has set forth a reparations and a set of guidelines in 2004. And there are many different kinds of reparations. One is what might be called two categories: material reparations, where the state or the collectivity gives material transfers to victims for crimes. But the other is an apology. Now, we may not instantly think of an apology as a reparation. We use a different term for it. But in a sense, an apology is reparative. It is meant to take responsibility for a past wrong, to atone for it, and in some way bring about remedy for it.
All right, that gives us a focus. Mario?
Well, if that is the case, then I guess perhaps that the same reparation we may need with a dictatorship in a particular country, which in the name of the state, they violate or they justify certain actions which were against human rights. So the next generation, when the dictatorship is gone, then there is a reaction to that, and there is a petition for reparation. Will that assessment will be correct?
Yes, and one of the interesting global trends in the past generation has been a whole wave of countries that have sought to leave behind dictatorship or civil war and make a transition to democracy or a peace settlement. There have been, some 90 countries have made the transition towards democracy. A record-setting set of countries has engaged in peace settlements since 1989. And so there are new practices that have emerged globally for trying to address these past injustices. And dictatorship is one of the major parts of it. And so different kinds of measures come to the fore. There's the call for truth-telling. There's a call for apologies. There's a call for reparations. There's a call for punishing the perpetrators of human rights crimes. And so reparations is one of the things that has increased globally in recent years. Now, it does go back a little bit. I think that the largest reparations settlement in history is that which the Federal Republic of Germany paid with respect to the Nazi crimes to the nation of Israel, the 1952 Luxembourg Agreement. But in more recent years, we've seen Chile, Argentina, Canada, Australia, and other cases of countries engaging in reparations to victims for what they suffered under a dictatorship. Yes.
And how can we avoid that action of reparation become instrument of certain ideologies? Because along this line, we can claim, or some people are doing that the conquest and colonization of Spain was done violating some of the basic human rights. And so then we can claim the reparation to the Kingdom of Spain.
Yes. Well, a couple of criticisms of reparations are, first of all, that they can become politicized, just instruments of one faction against another, one party against another. And then also that they become kind of endless, that, there are a lot of injustices out there in the world. And, how far back do we go? Do we go back to the Garden of Eden? Does every country give reparations for every, wrong in its history? Well, these are both legitimate objections, but I think they can both be addressed. And an answer to politicization is something that, it should be done even-handedly. It should be done for the largest crimes. It should be done for the crimes that most have ongoing wounds. It's true that not all of them can be addressed, but if we look at wrongs, human rights violations on objective grounds, some are larger than others, and if there are obvious selectivities, then that has to be avoided. But if you take a look at something like a country's treatment of its indigenous population, this is not politicized. This is, objectively true that this happened, that it was largely this group against that group. And so we can talk about reparations in a consensual way. That is also something very important, that the best apologies and reparations are ones that are negotiated, that are carefully crafted consensually, that a public case is made for them, that they're rendered as something that we are doing as a society. And if you look at something like Australia's reparations for its treatment of Native peoples, this is, the successful ones have those qualities. I had a dissertation student who wrote her dissertation on what makes for successful apologies. And those are some of the characteristics. There are other examples, say, for instance, Japan's in the 1990s and 2000s, which were largely politicized or seen as politicized. They were divisive. This had to do with Japan's crimes against Chinese and other neighbors in World War II. And only in the 1990s did they decide to have apologies. But the apologies really didn't succeed. There was a kind of a nationalist backlash against them. No, we weren't the perpetrators. We were much more victims. And what about them? What don't they need to apologize? And so it had that kind of politicized character to it, and really did not succeed in building consensus and reconciliation, but only in increasing division.
Dan, just a little technical thing. I'm getting a slight echo from you.
Okay.
Nothing significant, but I notice it. I don't know, perhaps you're a little close to the mic.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right. I'll try to sit back a little bit here.
Yeah. Now, 2 questions. When there's a discussion of just war, and there are so many discussions of it, sometimes people will say, well, in a war, an entire population is responsible. And I always argue that that's not the case, that an entire population is responsible. For example, in many instances, indiscriminate weapons are used against entire populations, which include dissidents within that population that actively oppose particular war. So that would suggest that sometimes an appeal to collective responsibility is far too sweeping. Now, shift that over to reparations. Suppose there's a recognizable partisan group within a given country that actively and at great risk, the members great risk to their own lives, oppose the policy of their own country. The war comes to an end. The country had been involved in actions that need to be addressed. But why is it that people who actively oppose those policies should now be held responsible for the actions which at the time they risked their lives opposed?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. It gets back to the collective versus individual nature of the wrong. So say I'm part of a country today where my country did something, in the past, grossly unjust. All of the citizens living today in the country are ones in whose name the act was committed, are part of the collectivity. And thus, all of them have a standing, because they are members of that collectivity, have a standing and even a certain responsibility, I think, to participate in that apology, or maybe pay part of one's tax money or what have you for the reparations, just simply as a way of taking responsibility for what was done in our name. But that's the collective dimension. The individual dimension differs. That's going to differ greatly depending on whether the person was, a hero, a villain, and indifferent, was alive then. Maybe what that person was an opponent of the injustices and so forth. And therefore, on the individual dimension, that person's culpability would be, greatly reduced to zero, or they may be, we should laud them as a hero for having opposed it. And so we should also do that on an individual basis. The logic of honors, we give honors to what people according to what they've done and what they deserve. And so it seems to me that one can have both of those things, that on one hand, as members of a collective in whom a wrong was done, we can say we as a collective are now going to join and endorse our collective's entities' apology or reparations on one hand. But then on the other, treating everyone as an individual, we acknowledge properly those who opposed, those who were indifferent, or those who were guilty. I think there are real world reference for these things. I mean, for instance, German leaders apologize for what happened. Germany as a nation continues to keep the memory alive of the Holocaust and continue to pass it down among its children, and calls all of its citizens to sort of remain contrite, to remember, to, has called its citizens to engage in paying reparations, right? And we don't think it's wrong to ask Germans to do this. On the other hand, we, on the individual level, we try war criminals. We give honors to those who opposed the injustices. If you go to Germany, there are streets named after people who gave their lives standing up to the Nazis, Sophie Scholl and General Beck and so forth. But we also remember the many who were indifferent or who just kind of passively went along. As philosophers such as Karl Jaspers have helped us to remember. So it seems to be these differentiated judgments are possible, and we can point to real world reference for them.
Some sorting and sifting.
Yes.
Very difficult. Now, I have one more question that I want to put in here before I encourage Mario to come back. You speak of an historical injustice, true historical injustice, the sort of thing that we ought to be thinking about, making reparations for, apologizing for, as a violation of natural law. But I don't know of any country today that in any official way recognizes the existence of natural law.
Yeah.
So what would be a legitimate, reasonable, compelling foundation for reparations, atonement, apology, if there's no appeal to be made to natural law?
Yeah. Well, I think you make a good point that natural law as a philosophy is something that all too few of us seem to recognize, right? Even among natural law philosophers, there are intense nuclear quality disputes over what the best justification is and so forth. But I would say two things. One is, if natural law is true, which I think we all on this conversation think that it is, it's something that we have, even if we don't acknowledge its existence in in theory or as a philosophy. It's something that every human being has. It's written on the heart, right? As Apostle Paul said. I mean, J. Budziszewski, the natural law philosopher in Texas, says that natural law is something that you can't not know. And so at some level, everyone has the natural law. But second of all, we do see the natural law reflected and embodied in laws and constitutions in many ways. And if you look at international law, there's a universal declaration of human rights. There are norms against aggression. There are norms against war crimes in humanitarian law. And so I think there's this phrase, the common conscience of mankind. I think that was in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Even if we can argue till we're blue in the face about natural law, there are still lots of ways in which natural law is reflected in the architecture of our shared institutions. And now this isn't to say that law perfectly tracks this is not to say that positive law perfectly tracks natural law. I mean, in some ways it, egregiously departs from it. Think about abortion, for instance. I don't want to make a kind of easy equation, but nevertheless, there is a kind of a deep structured sense in which natural law is reflected in our institutions. Most every country in the world today has a constitution. Most every constitution has a Bill of Rights. Well, human rights are, most of them are rooted in natural law, and most of them find a place in, constitutions. Court systems are built around the basic intuition that committing a crime renders one guilty and liable to punishment. So that basic kind of axiomatic intuition of retribution is kind of structured into our norms and institutions. And so, these things can be appealed to, even if we don't have the philosophical agreement. These things can be appealed to as shared norms. We can get a fair distance by doing that. And certainly on racism, almost nobody today would argue that the racist actions or history were justified. I mean, most of the heavy disputes about reparations today have to do with, is there still racism? If you give this money to people, will it really have a good effect? Does it just deepen divisions? Things like that. But nobody disputes the basic norms of racism. And so I think we have natural law substantially embedded in institutions in a way that can provide us with shared standards.
Thank you. That's helpful too. Mario.
It's very interesting. You keep me thinking about the situation in different countries. Just a couple of examples. Spain, they have enacted the law of historical memory. Mm-hmm. So the government somehow selected memory justify one side of the civil war. Mm-hmm. And so was completely politicized how we understand history. The same thing you have in Argentina a week ago, where those who are in power, which are progressive, so to speak, even though they come in from a traditional Peronista movement, co-opted, if you will, the May the 25th, which is the Independence Day, and they gave completely an interpretation from this tradition. So, and that comes from precisely the idea of reparation, at least from the 1985, which they gave enhanced the theory of rejecting the theory of the two demons. In other words, violation of human rights were done by the state. We agree on that, but also they deny were violated by the guerrilla movement, so that they look just one side. Mm-hmm. So, and that still have not healed the profound wound in that society.
Yeah.
So, and the question is, again, going back to what I said, I have a friend of mine in Spain who is a philosopher. He said, what we are doing now, we are just erasing or deleting the common sense from which we can understand what human right is. So everything seems to be politicized, particularly in this postmodern world. So my question is, how then we move toward a more, quote unquote, objective view of these violations?
Yes, no, it's an excellent point, and yes, Argentina is a good example of how this dealing with the past through punishment, apologies, reparations can be very politicized. So one group wants to look at, one set of human rights violations, another set. Oftentimes there's denial towards one's own, and I gave the example of Japan as well. Sometimes these measures, increase divisions, I think the problem there, we shouldn't label the problem there though as one of relativism. Even peoples who accept the standards of human rights, are going to have very different memories or very different accounts of things. Now, there are divisions about whether human rights can be violated because of national emergencies. I think during the Dirty War, those who defend the actions of the disappeared peoples and so forth would say, normally you can't do this, but this was a national emergency that, the country was being threatened with civil war and so forth. And but nevertheless, I think the problem, though, it has to do with selectivity, with politicization, with different sides having different accounts of what happened, but who is responsible and so forth. And I can only say that, it's, these are just pragmatic problems with political divisions. There may be cases where it's not wise to go forth with an apology or reparations just because on prudential grounds, it's not likely to, gain a consensus. And there are other countries, though, where it's been much more successful. Germany, Canada, Australia, where there is a wide popular consensus that, yes, those things were wrong. Yes, we should make good on it. And we should continue to do so. So, I think it's hard to give any real solid theoretical answer to this problem. I don't think it really calls into question the moral case, but it does suggest that, there's a strong political case there, to try to build consensus, to try to, take those kinds of actions that can build consensus. I think one of those is for different sides to acknowledge the wrongs of their own side. But we do see this sometimes. Like South Africa after apartheid, there was compared to other countries, a remarkably wide example of officials who had been apartheid officials who later came to apologize. And they did so in a context where reconciliation and forgiveness was being emphasized. Now, there are still divisions. There's still many in South Africa who say it was inadequate, it was unfair, it was skewed, and so forth and so on. So these things will, in this world, in this side of the veil, it's always going to be partially achieved. And so, there's a lot of prudence and a lot of, the art of politics that's going to be involved, which is going to determine whether and how reparations and apologies ought to be pursued.
Let me go ahead, Mario.
No, just one quick question. We talk about forgiveness. Does forgiveness include necessarily reparation? Or like I just forgive my friend that he owed me such and such thing, and I say, I forgive you, forget about it.
Yeah. Well, it's a really good question. Forgiveness is one of the remarkable things about global politics in the past generation is the emergence of forgiveness. And it's talked about and practiced and has been in a number of different countries, usually by individual victims. And So what does it mean, and what does it mean for other practices? But one thing that I would argue is that forgiveness does not mean that we relinquish other just practices, such as just punishment, acknowledgement, reparations, apology, other forms of repair, memory that need to take place. So forgiving doesn't mean we should relinquish those other measures of justice. And I think that, people who have forgiven usually don't relinquish them or say that they're wrong. What is forgiveness then? Well, I look closely at the text of Jesus' commandment to forgive. He said, "Forgive them their debts."
Mm-hmm.
And so what? So that presupposes that there's a debt, that sin leaves a kind of a debt. And here, what I think is happening is the concept of debt is an economic metaphor that is used for moral wrong and for a kind of moral status that wrongdoing leaves. And that term debt for sin actually came through Aramaic. It came into the Bible around the 5th century BC and was prevalent in the Second Temple time. And so therefore Jesus uses the language. So what does it mean to say that there's a moral debt for sin? Well, and then Jesus is saying, forgo that moral debt. Well, what is a moral debt for sin? Well, if somebody wrongs you, there is a kind of moral debt and probably some kind of some just retribution. I mean, you might decide not to talk to somebody. You might decide not to show up at the person's parties. You might decide not to speak well of the person. You might, there is a kind of, just kind of retributive actions that we take, proportionate and so forth, for wrongs. And Jesus is saying to forgo those. And also, I think forgiveness involves a will towards the restoration of the perpetrator. And so I look at people who have forgiven in situations of armed conflict. And so you have to ask, well, what does that mean then, that they're forgoing the moral debt? And then what does it mean that it does not involve forgoing just punishment and so forth? It's hard to answer exactly. But I think about when John Paul II went to visit his assassin in prison and forgave him. Now, John Paul II, as far as I know, never called for the person's prison sentence to be commuted. He didn't say this person should be let free from prison. But yet he went in and he forgave him. So what did that mean, that he was forgiving him, even while he wasn't, trying to break him out of prison? Well, there must be some sense in which John Paul was forgiving a kind of a moral debt. He was choosing to look upon that person in a different way, not as somebody who owes me something, even though you tried to take my life, you tried to kill me. But I'm now deciding to will your good. I don't look at you as somebody who I'm asking for, retributive action that I perform against you or that you owe me, but rather I want to say, I wish you your good. I hope that you would repent for this. I hope that you would, undergo a kind of moral improvement. That you say, I hope that you renounce this and then become somebody who doesn't do these things, who, comes to be redeemed and be restored. So it's a kind of maybe it's a change in the way that one looks upon that perpetrator. Maybe it's best illustrated through these kinds of examples.
We are always to love our enemies. It's not that we don't have enemies, but we are always to love them, which is to say we are always to seek their good, to affirm that their good is in fact something that we ought to advance. And in certain contexts, perhaps to forgive someone is to say once again, yes, though you have treated me wrongly, and in a sense you are my enemy, I nonetheless forgive you and publicly proclaim that I recognize my duty is to love you. Perhaps it could be forgiveness directed towards a reaffirmation of love. Perhaps. Now, I think that the core idea of your position is absolutely right. And not only is it absolutely right, but you're ready to acknowledge the tendencies towards politicization and distortion and so forth. And to some extent, I feel like I'm losing track of your major point and your major argument and its rightness by bringing in related questions. But in order to effectuate the reforms and the reform of the spirit that you are advocating, we do need to address these secondary considerations. Mm-hmm. And here's one secondary consideration. Very oftentimes, a group is charged with cultural imperialism. And there's an effort to address that problem of cultural imperialism. And yet, in some cases, I don't really think there is at root a cultural imperialism. Here's one example. In California, for at least 30 or 40 years, there's been an effort to teach Ebonics in the public schools. And the idea is, speaking very, very, very broadly, you want these kids to read the plays of Shakespeare? Why, that's cultural imperialism. Instead, they should read Black authors and develop a greater facility for speaking Black English, and they should do so without any apology whatsoever. They should feel free to do so, and they should receive at least equal funding through the public education to develop the linguistic cultures connected with Ebonics and the like. Now, my first reaction would be, no, that's not cultural imperialism, or it certainly need not be cultural imperialism. This is fundamentally an English-speaking country. It might not remain so, and it need not remain so, but it is that now. And when we teach the English classics, it's not a matter of cultural imperialism. Mm-hmm. And then I'd be inclined to go ahead further and say to liberationist groups, speaking very, very broadly, who say that we ought to rethink Catholic theology and use the categories of different cultures altogether. And what I'd want to say is, well, some cultures might not be able to supply the conceptual grounds for Catholic theology that, say, classical Greek philosophy has, in fact, supplied.
Yes.
In one sense, these sorts of questions are removed from what you're speaking of. And yet, in another sense, you want to say that we have to look at case number 1, and then look at case number 21, and then look at case number 121, and avoid trivialization and politicization. And on the trivial side, just another example, it's often charged that it's culturally insensitive for an Anglo to have dreadlocks. And yet we're oftentimes told that we ought to look to other cultures and draw on their contributions wherever it is. And if somebody were to say in the United States, wear a sari because they really thought they were a lot better, than some of the products that are now being purveyed. Well, I think you see where I'm headed. Any thoughts here?
Yeah. Well, I have to say, one of the reasons I articulated this Christian view of reparations, and there's kind of a subtext here, although I don't kind of wear it on my sleeve, but it is an effort to differentiate what I think is the strongest case for reparations from some of the, frankly, strongest voices advocating for reparations and against racism today. And really the criterion by which we can distinguish, cultural imperialism from genuine forms of justice is truth. And then it comes back to natural law and certain teachings of Jesus, which I think build upon the natural law. And what I want to do is root this case in the kind of civilizational heritage and American heritage of the valid affirmations of truth that I think represent cultural achievements. And in America is a mixed bag. There's great injustices. Look at our Constitution. At that time, it basically it failed to outlaw slavery. But in the Constitution and the Declaration, we also have basic human rights. We have the great achievement of religious freedom. We've got, the dignity of the person created in the image of God. And those are extremely important. And in our history, Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King and even Barack Obama all appeal back to that heritage of truth that we have as part of our national history. And from that basis, opposing racism, arguing for reparations, and so forth. Unfortunately, a lot of the kind of contemporary opponents of racism seems to have abandoned this heritage. They're speaking more out of the kind of intellectual currents that are dominant in the academy in the last many decades. Foucault, and it's all about power. It's all about deconstruction. It's all about overthrowing the heritage, overthrowing the institutions, but really from a point of nowhere, without any real moral basis. All just power against power. And I think that's very destructive because it doesn't give us any basis for these principles, but it also extremely divisive. It threatens to tear the Republic apart. So you look at like the 1619 Project, which wants to kind of deconstruct the founding and say we shouldn't go back to 1776. Well, that's the whole platform. I mean, look at Martin Luther King. It wasn't, coincidence that he stood up in front of the Lincoln Memorial when he gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. He looked back to the founding and he said there's a promissory note that hasn't been cashed yet. He's appealing to our history. He appealed back to Lincoln. Lincoln appealed back to the Declaration. And so we have shared truth. And that's the promising basis on which to build consensus. And I think that's what reparations and apologies are really about, is repairing the fabric, consonantly with our tradition and our history, the human rights magisterium, as you might put it. So I'm also very concerned with some of the kind of underlying currents, even if I agree with some of the proposals made by some of the most prominent articulators of opposition to racism and so forth. I'm very skeptical of the basis and the way in which they go about it.
So the Spartacist League or the Red Guard, they don't in any way undercut the truths of the Hebrew prophets.
Correct. Those truths are remaining, and there's plenty of basis there for a prophetic denunciation of injustices, but it only makes sense if it's rooted in truth.
Thank you. Mario.
Let's change a little bit about this aspect and move into wealth inequality. As you write that it's entirely plausible to attribute vast inequality in wealth, position, opportunity, faced by African Americans today to historical injustices faced within the past 2 generations. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. Well, I was reading a blog post yesterday by some skeptics of reparations, and they were saying, well, take a struggling town in Ohio. Why is it right to give reparations to African Americans, but not to the white working class, which is also, struggling with opioids and the decline of industry and so forth and so on? But the thing is that the problem is not merely an economic one. It's not that African Americans are poor or what have you. The problem is that it's the result of a wrong, a colossal crime, and that actively and explicitly discriminated between African Americans and whites, and it's that crime of racism, of the discrimination, that is the wrong, right? So, yeah, poverty is bad. Yes, opioid addictions are bad. Yes, the plight of the working class is bad. Yes, we should do something about it. Yes, we should care about it. But with the racism, there's something additional. There's the historical injustice of the discrimination directed against this group of people. That's the real thing that demands reparations. Reparations are different from, say, an anti-poverty program. Just as, a bunch of people who are wounded from a massacre differs from people whose town was destroyed by a tornado. There's a moral wrong in the first place, whereas the second is, a result of a natural disaster. Yes, we should help them, but there's something morally different where there was a wrong committed. One of the eye-opening things for me was looking at the economic discrimination. In the 1930s and 1940s, due to the New Deal and the Fair Deal, an enormous amount of money was transferred to people through the Social Security and the GI Bill and so forth. And yet African Americans were actively and explicitly denied, or vastly disproportionately denied, these funds. And so Ira Katznelson calls it when affirmative action was white. So people who are against affirmative action ought to think about the fact that vast affirmative action was practiced, but it was practiced on behalf of whites. And so this did much, along with redlining and so forth, to create the vast economic disparities we have today. But the problem is not just the economic disparities; it's the wrong.
Let me introduce another theme here. We are, all of us, members of the American Solidarity Party.
Yes.
And that party is really based on Catholic social thought. Mm-hmm. And a key element of Catholic social thought is the principle of subsidiarity.
Yes.
And Jacques Maritain, once upon a time, and we should keep him in mind always, said that one of the great difficulties in world government is that people really hadn't taken into account fully their own national contributions, and hadn't really taken into account the connections that need to be made between the national and the international. Now, how about connections between the state, as in, say, the state of Illinois, the state of California, and the United States? Or how about the connections between specific municipalities in the state and going up? And what I'm suggesting is that in order for reconciliation and apology and reparations not to be hollow moves, not to be cosmetic moves, there has to be a real deep support for them. And that support might best begin at the local level. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I want to take two particular cases. In Evanston, Illinois, demonstrably, African Americans were redlined out of parts of the town, significant parts of the town, in such a way that they simply could not buy homes. It just couldn't be done. I mean, maybe there'd be some outlier or other who would manage to buy a home, But the great majority of blacks simply could not buy in major areas of Evanston. And this was a matter of historical record, and it was acknowledged as such. Nobody denied it. It happened. It was clearly the case that it happened. And the city of Evanston moved to make reparations on that basis. And they were able to draw on particular sets of data and make reparations that were significant and correlated. All right, that's Illinois. Here in SoCal, Southern California, there has just been effected a significant reparation. There was in one of our fabled beach communities, in which communities there's not left a single square inch for anybody to enjoy the beach or the sun or anything else, there was a black resort. It was owned by black people. It especially welcomed black people. And one of the beach communities simply, legally under the guise of law, forced them out, resold the land to a group of white investors. This happened. Nobody denies that it happened. Now, reparations have been made. The land has been returned. I think a case for reparation might very well, I'm sure you would agree with this, benefit at a national level if actions that were focused on local levels were promoted again and again as exemplars of what this might mean, concrete examples of what this might mean. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, I think these are really interesting. And so when we talk about collective injustices, justices committed in the name of a collective, there are different collectives that have done them. There are state governments, local governments, and the federal government. And I think there's something very valuable about looking back at the injustices that particular government committed in a relatively kind of concentrated, agentic sort of way. That's a fancy way of saying that it was mainly that institution who did it, right? And so if a city passed ordinances or practiced redlining or something, then there's something to be said about that city doing the reparations. And so, yes, I think there's a lot to be said for subsidiarity there. And other organizations, I think Georgetown University had a wonderful set of processes just a few years ago. I think they really did it right. They looked back at the history of owning slaves and selling slaves in its own history, and had public events, had substantial reparations paid in the forms of scholarships and so forth, and really sought to build a consensus. And I think it was done in a really good way at the level of that university. And so there's a kind of matching logic here by which the institutions who did it most intentionally, then perform the reparations. The one thing I would say, though, is that I still think there is a strong case for the federal government to take a central role. First of all, the amount of reparations that really would be justified are the ones that is the amount that only the federal government would be capable of paying. I also think there is some sense in which the federal government, the Constitution ultimately is a federal document. It's for us all. There's some sense in which the federal government is always responsible, even if invidious laws of discrimination take place at the level of the state. I mean, ultimately, there's a responsibility of the federal government to do something about it. I mean, ultimately, in the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s, we had the federal government going down and enforcing against discrimination. And, we had the Congress passing the, Equality Acts, 1964, Civil Rights Acts in 1964, 1965. And so even though the discrimination may have been happening at the level of states, it was the federal government that has a certain responsibility of saying, no, you can't do that. So I basically am sympathetic with the matching idea, doing it at the level at which it was committed, but also remembering that there's still a responsibility that primarily and only the federal government has.
Both and.
Both and, yes.
Mario, we have time for one last question.
We do. What do you think about the concept of covenant? Will that concept mean something in this secularized world that we live in?
Yes. Well, that's very interesting because here's where I think the Christian resources, which were appealed to by Lincoln and Frederick Douglass and Martin Luther King, have a great deal to offer in terms of, confronting the original sin. So, if you take the analogy of original sin a little bit further, yes, there's original sin, but Christianity doesn't end there. I mean, God has a response to original sin, in the cross and resurrection, and that's not the end of the story. There's redemption. And there was a great volume edited a couple years ago on race and covenant by a group of Christians talking about the notion of a national covenant with respect to race and reconciliation. And, thinkers such as Frederick Douglass saw the nation as a collectivity that could commit wrongs as a collectivity, could suffer the consequences of those wrongs as a collectivity, but also could make acts of atonement and acts of reparation and seek forgiveness as a community. And I think Lincoln spoke this way in the second inaugural when he portrayed the Civil War as a kind of a punishment or a kind of consequence of slavery that the nation as a whole was facing. And again, he used very theologically rich concepts. And now to talk about covenant, again, one must keep in mind everything I said about the differences between collective and individual, and it doesn't erode or individual responsibility or wrongly assign individual responsibility, doesn't erode people's freedom to act or not act on it. But the covenant recognizes that we as a nation, as a collectivity, engage in moral responsibility and acts of repair. And for most of the history of Western countries, including the United States, but also European countries, during their Christian history, it was very common to talk about countries as having a kind of moral status. Countries could sin. Countries could, apologize. Countries could suffer for their sins. Countries could seek repair and forgiveness and restoration, just as ancient Israel could. But as you mentioned, we live in a secularized time. And in the United States, this kind of talk has gradually departed from the mainstream of our civic conversation, particularly after the Vietnam War. It is mostly, voices from the religious right, in a rather dubious fashion, I think, who speak this way, God punishing us for homosexuality and so forth. But it used to be much more of a consensual, widely shared thing that was also that was often invoked with respect to racism. And whether this could be resurrected, I'm not sure. I think Christians could still continue to advocate it, and maybe it's something that others could appreciate in a more secularized form. Really, just the idea that we as a collective have a responsibility, and we as a collective might seek to repair the fabric. But it really is a deeply Christian idea.
Thank you so much. We're going to, as we always do, finish with the gospel for the day. And this is the Feast of the Visitation. Mary set out and traveled to the hill country in haste to a town of Judah, where she entered the house of Zechariah and greeted Elizabeth. When Elizabeth heard Mary's greeting, the infant leaped in her womb, and Elizabeth, filled with the Holy Spirit, cried out in a loud voice and said, "Most blessed are you among women, and blessed is the fruit of your womb. And how does this happen to me, that the mother of my Lord should come to me? For at the moment the sound of your greeting reached my ears, the infant in my womb leaped for joy. Blessed are you who believed that what was spoken to you by the Lord would be fulfilled. And Mary said, my soul proclaims the greatness of the Lord. My spirit rejoices in God my Savior, for he has looked with favor on his lowly servant. From this day all generations will call me blessed. The Almighty has done great things for me, and holy is his name. He has mercy on those who fear him in every generation. He has shown the strength of his arm. He has scattered the proud in their conceit. He has cast down the mighty from their thrones and has lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things, and the rich he has sent away empty. He has come to the help of his servant Israel, for he has remembered his promise of mercy, the promise he made to our fathers, to Abraham and his children forever. Mary remained with her about 3 months and then returned to her home. Come, Lord Jesus, come.
Amen.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for this great opportunity. And I love this podcast. I love your show, and would love to continue to follow it, and greatly admire all that you guys do.
And we really appreciate all your pro bono efforts.
I'm not being paid for this? Wait a second.
All right. Godspeed.
Okay.
The check is in the mail.
As always. Thank you.
Hello, God's beloved. I'm Annabelle Mosley, author, professor of theology, and host of Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. I invite you to listen in and find inspiration along this sacred journey we're traveling together to make our lives a masterpiece and, with God's grace, become saints. Join me, Annabelle Mosley, for Then Sings My Soul and Destination Sainthood on WCAT Radio. God bless you. Remember, you're never alone. God is always with you.
Thank you for listening to a production of WCAT Radio. Please join us in our mission of evangelization. And don't forget, love lifts up when knowledge takes flight.